Good evening. Welcome to our evening service here at Crossroads Baptist Church. We stream, or I shouldn't say stream, we produce a video lesson every Sunday evening or most Sunday evenings. And we are studying our doctrinal statement, and we have now come to the point in our doctrinal statement that's about marriage. And so you can see that there on your title, on the title screen. So you're going to need your Bible as usual, so make sure you have that in front of you. So let's take a look at the statement that we have. These are the words in our doctrinal statement concerning marriage. We believe that God created Adam and Eve and then united them in the first marriage, thus creating the institution of marriage. Marriage, as patterned by God in Genesis, is between one man and one woman, and is a sacred covenant intended for life, dissolved at death. God, as the creator of marriage, is thus the only one who may define it. Marriage, this great mystery, is an exclusive relationship and, as a husband and wife walk with God, one that exemplifies the love of God. Indeed, this covenant is seen as an illustration of the relationship of Christ to his church. Marriage is intended not only to meet the needs of mankind, but bring glory to God through a loving, holy, and obedient relationship along with any offspring. Genesis chapter 2, verses 20 through 25, Malachi chapter 2, verse 14, Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 33, Matthew chapter 22, verses 22 through 40, 1 Peter chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 1 through 5, and Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 through 5. So let's take a look at the scriptures here. Start with Genesis. Well, let me back up. Let me make a few comments about this statement. First thing we see is that it's a long statement. And I would be of the opinion that if we had to write this again, we would not make it this long. There are several points that I think in here that kind of wander away from the main point. Are we talking about marriage, or are we trying to talk about the full doctrine of what the relationship is between a husband and wife, and a wife to her husband, and that type of thing? It seems to me that in a doctrinal statement about marriage, that the main thing is about the nature of marriage. And I don't think, for instance, that the very first sentence, we don't need that sentence in a doctrinal statement about marriage. Now, we believe that's true, but we don't necessarily need it, because the second sentence picks right up on that without getting into too many details. We see some points that need to be made in any statement about marriage. And for instance, it's patterned by God in Genesis. It's between a one man and one woman. It's a sacred covenant intended for life. It's dissolved by death. These things are all important. I think it's also important, as our statement has, is that God is the one who created marriage, and therefore he gets to define it and no one else. I think from this point on in the statement, where it talks about marriage is a great mystery, pretty much to the end, I don't know how helpful any of that is for defining the nature of marriage. So I think it's a little bit too long, and it kind of goes off the main point a little bit. Anyway, you think about those things here, because keep in mind, when we look at a doctrinal statement, doctrinal statements are made by men, and they're made by men within a certain historical context, a time in which it's written, and so we have to understand that, and we have to deal with that, and that means all doctrinal statements from time to time need updated. But we also have to keep in mind that as men write these doctrinal statements, and they have verses that they believe support their doctrinal statement, we have to ensure that those verses actually do. That's the most important thing. It's not necessarily is the statement saying what is biblically true, but is the statement saying what the passages say that we list? So this is the really the point. If we didn't have any passages listed there, we could probably just say, well, these are biblically true statements. But as soon as you list the passages, you're saying these passages teach what is in this statement. So again, that's something to think about as we evaluate this. Also, I need to tell you that this statement about marriage is a more recent addition to our church's doctrinal statement. It's a reaction. It's a needed reaction to the continual downward spiral of our culture's view of marriage. And in fact, this statement on marriage now is behind the times in that it doesn't address some things that need to be addressed in the world in which we live. Things that 30 years ago nobody would have even thought we even need to mention or think about these things. They are obvious. But they are what they are, and we have to address them. So let's look at the scriptures here real quick. Genesis chapter 2, verses 20 through 25. I'll just say I think the first verses 20 through 21 are not really needed. In fact, probably verses 20 through 23 are probably not needed. Verses 24 through 25 are probably sufficient for our point, and so I'm going to read those. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become one flesh. And they were both naked, the man and his wife, and were not ashamed. So this is the establishment of marriage. It's between one man and one woman. It's established by God and therefore is defined by God in His Word. So this is one of the key passages that you have to have in any statement on marriage. But again, as I'd say, verses 24 and 25 are sufficient to prove this point. Let's go to Malachi chapter 2, verse 14. Malachi 2:14. Yet you say, for this reason, because the Lord has been witness between you and the wife of your youth, with whom you have dealt treacherously, yet she is your companion and your wife by covenant. This gives us something of the covenantal nature of a marriage. Now, it uses the word covenant here, and I suppose that's why this passage was picked. Although I think the Genesis 2 passage could also be used for this point. But here it clearly says, she's your companion and your wife by covenant. So this is talking about the covenantal nature of marriage, which simply means it's like a contract, a binding contract between two people. But here it also tells us that God is the witness to this contract. So this is not just a covenant between a man and a woman. This is a covenant of marriage between a man and a woman that is before God. And again, this emphasizes, too, the sacred nature of a marriage, that a marriage isn't just something that's approved of by society, but it actually is something that has to fit God's revelation. Let's look at the next passage. Again, this is a longer passage. I think I would reduce it because this passage says a lot. I'll read the whole thing, though. Ephesians chapter 5, verses 22 through 33. Wives, submit to your own husbands as to the Lord. For the husband is the head of the wife, as also Christ is the head of the church, and he is the Savior of the body. Therefore, just as the church is subject to Christ, so let the wives be to their own husbands in everything. Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he may sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy and without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. He who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother, and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless, let each one of you in particular so love his own wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Now, I'm not totally sure why this particular passage is used, because it speaks more of the roles of a husband and wife in marriage than of what a marriage is. If anything here, it is talking about how the husband and wife should relate together as parts in a single union. I mean, really, that's, if you look at the last part of this, where it's talking about verse 30, for we are members of his body, of his flesh, and his bones. That's talking about our union with Christ, the believer's union with Christ. And then it goes on, and as an explanation here, for this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall be, the two shall become one flesh. This is the great mystery. What's the great mystery? Two becoming one. That's the great mystery. Marriage isn't a great mystery. The two becoming one flesh is a great mystery. And Paul says, but I speak concerning Christ and the church, how Christ and the church are one. They are in union. And so I think that's what it's talking about here. And I mean, that is certainly the union between husband and wife is certainly a part of marriage, but this passage seems to be more emphasizing the roles that each one brings to that union, the role of the wife in submitting and respecting her husband, and the role of the husband in loving his wife. So I'm not sure exactly that this passage clearly really supports our statement as it's written. So this for me, this is a question mark passage. Again, this passage wouldn't be needed because it quotes from Genesis chapter 2. As far as the nature and definition of a marriage goes, it already quotes from Genesis 2, and we've already got that as a part of our statement. So again, it might just be that it's redundant. I don't know, but I have a question mark here. Now let's look at Matthew 22, verses 22 through 40, another long passage. And I'm just going to summarize this passage instead of read. You can read along, but I'm going to summarize. So Jesus is responding to a question by the Sadducees, and the Sadducees, of course, believe there's no resurrection. And so their question is that according to the law, if a man dies without having children, then his brother is to take the widow as his wife. And so they get into this complicated, convoluted question in verse 25, and there's 7 brothers, and all these guys die, and they don't have any children. They all die with the same wife. So the first one marries this woman, he dies. And so the second brother marries the widow, dies. And the third marries the widow, it dies. So they all die without children, and then the woman dies. And so in the resurrection, when they're raised, the question is, whose wife is she going to be? Which one of these 7 is this woman the wife of? And Jesus basically is going to tell them, look, in the resurrection or in the life after death, there's neither nobody marries or is given in marriage. So there's no marrying or given in marriage, but they're like the angels, which is a little bit confusing, whatever that means. They're like the angels. People think they know what that means, and they suppose they know what that means, but we're not really told what that means. But Jesus clearly knows what it means, and the Sadducees clearly understood what it means. And so I think at best we could say that what Jesus is saying here is that marriage is not an issue in heaven. Marriage is not an issue in heaven, as when people die, their marriage is dissolved. But that's certainly not the point of the context. Jesus isn't teaching about marriage here. He's responding to a question that the Sadducees are asking him in order to trip him up about marriage or about the law. They don't believe that any of this matters, that their question is even a real question, because they don't even believe in a resurrection. So they're not asking Jesus a real question. They're not looking for understanding. They're just trying to trip Jesus up. So I wouldn't use this particular passage to prove the point that I think that this passage is being used for. I think there's other passages, so I would eliminate this passage. But I think, at least in a broad sense, it's talking about death dissolves marriage. But there's another passage we're going to look at that's better. Let's go to the next one. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 7. I'm not going to read this one either. You can read it. I'm just going to summarize, because this passage is just talking about the relationship between a wife and a husband, not the nature of a marriage. It's not defining anything about the marriage. It's talking about the relationship between a husband and wife. And I think that's important, but we have to ask the question, is that important for our statement on marriage, especially in today's climate? I mean, certainly we would agree with everything this passage says, but it's really talking about what's the role of a husband in the relationship between he and his wife, and what's the role of the wife in the relationship between her and her husband. So I don't think I would include this as supporting our doctrinal statement. I wouldn't include it as a support passage. Let's go to the next passage then. 1 Corinthians 7, 1 through 5. It says, "Now concerning the things which you wrote me, it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Nevertheless, because of sexual immorality, let each man have his own wife, and let each woman have her own husband. Let the husband render to his wife the affection due her, and likewise also the wife to her husband. The wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but the husband does, and likewise the husband doesn't have authority over his own body, but the wife does. Do not deprive one another, except with consent for a time, that you may give yourself to fasting and prayer, and come together again, so that Satan does not tempt you because of your lack of self-control." So this passage is about the sexual obligation in a marriage, that a husband is obligated to his wife, and a wife is obligated to her husband, that they are to fulfill each other's sexual needs. That's what it's about. Our passage, or I shouldn't say our passage, our statement doesn't say anything about this. So again, this is kind of getting off. If you read this and read our statement, you wouldn't see how it fits together. Again, this is important for a marriage, I think. But again, this is not, I don't think this is where our statement is leading us to. It's not talking about all the different aspects that go into a marriage. It's just talking about a marriage. And also, I would point out this passage indicates that the sexual relationship between a husband and wife is not just about producing offspring. It's not just about producing kids. Some people have that mistaken idea that sex is only for reproduction, but that's not what it's for. I mean, it is what it's for, but that's not all that it's for. So let's go on to the next. So I wouldn't include this. Let's go to Matthew chapter 7 or chapter 19. Now I've included verse 6 in here, just because I think maybe there was just a typo error. But the statement only lists verses 4 and 5. Here's what it says. And he answered and said to them, have you not read that he who made them at the beginning made them male and female? And said, for this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall be one flesh. So then they are no longer two, but one flesh. Therefore what God has joined together, let not man separate. Now, I think verse 6 is important because it indicates that God's the one who did this joining together, that he's the one who designed and made marriage and defines marriage, and not just what a man or a woman think. So that's why I think that's important. If it's just a reference to verses 4 and 5, I don't think we need it, because this is quoting from Genesis 2, verses 24. Verse 24, which we already have as a part of our statement. So we don't need to repeat what we already have. So if we're including verse 6 in here to help show that this is something that God does, that he clearly does this, that he clearly joined them together, then I think we keep it. But if we're just repeating Genesis 2, verse 24, I think we can do away with it. So I do think there's one additional passage that we should probably consider. And I mentioned that I don't think that the Matthew 22 passage is worth including, because the point of the passage isn't the idea that death dissolves marriage. It's Jesus answering these Sadducees who are trying to trip him up. However, Romans chapter 7 verses 1 through 3 clearly indicates that a marriage is dissolved at death. So Matthew chapter 7 verse 1 says, or do you not know, brethren, for I speak to those who know the law, so he's speaking to Jews, that the law has dominion over a man as long as he lives? For a woman who has a husband is bound by law to her husband as long as he lives. So there's a connection between your obligation to the law of Moses and the obligation of a wife to her husband's law. The idea is as long as you both are living, you're obligated. So if you're living, and you're a Jew, you're obligated to follow the law of Moses. And if you're a wife, as long as there is both spouses are alive, you're bound to the law of your husband. But if the husband dies, she's released from the law of her husband. So she's no longer married. She's no longer under that contract, that covenant with her husband. So I think this would go on to prove that death dissolves marriage. And it might be something to include in our passage. Or in our statement here. So let me wrap this up with a conclusion. I do think there is some disjunction between our statement and some of the scriptures that are used to support it. There are several references that are used which speak of the roles and relationships between a husband and wife, but not the actual nature, definition of a marriage, what a marriage is. And so I don't think we need those in our statement on marriage. I think our statement on marriage has to be focused on what is marriage, what defines marriage, not what goes on within a marriage. The degradation of marriage has continued since this statement was added to our doctrinal statement. And while not that long ago we would have never even entertained the idea that marriage must be explicitly defined as between one man and one woman, we now find that we are in a position where we actually need to define what a man is and what a woman is before we can even bring up the issue of marriage. And so we have to define a man as a biological male at birth and a woman as a biological female at birth. These explanatory statements have to be included in our statement in some way to protect from people who are transgender from either engaging in a homosexual marriage or just a confusion of life. So we have to include this in some way here into our statement that we believe that marriage is only between one biological male from birth and one biological female from birth. Something to that effect. We also need to consider the fact that this statement that we have is a bit long and a bit wandering in what it says. It kind of wanders. It doesn't stick to the point, the most important point that needs to be made. So, listen to some other statements on this issue that other churches have come up with, which I think are pretty good. One church just lists it this way in their doctrinal statement. They say human sexuality. Okay, that's something we probably need to think about, that we're not just addressing marriage, but we're also addressing sexuality. Sexuality being the broader idea. Here's what they say. We believe that God has ordained the institution of marriage, which is the union between one man and one woman. We further believe that God has reserved sexual acts for marriage, so the practice of sex outside of marriage is sin. And Genesis 2, Romans 1, 1 Corinthians 6 are used as support passages. Another doctrinal statement puts it this way. It's the point's entitled Marriage and Sexuality. We believe that God has ordained the institution of marriage, which is the union between one man and one woman, as genetically defined and created by God. We further believe that God has reserved sexual acts in practice for marriage, and so the practice of sex outside of marriage is sin. And they list some of the similar passages. I like that second one most because it includes here this genetically defined and created by God. So you can't decide what gender or sex you are. And so these are shorter than our statement, and I think they're more to the point that needs to be addressed. And I think we need to adapt our statement to the modern needs in the area of marriage and sexuality. And so our statement says things that are true and good, things that we need to know about, but it kind of wanders off the topic, the most important topic, when it talks about marriage. And because of the age of it, it also fails to address some of the more contemporary issues that have come up in marriage that we need to include in our doctrinal statement as a way to protect us from ever having to condone or allow things that we don't believe are biblical marriages to ever take place in our church. So a very important issue of marriage and sexuality. Well, as always, may the Lord bless you as you continue to live pleasing and acceptable to Him.